Okay, beautiful. So, what I'm going to talk about for the last half here is basically different options about thinking what properties are and how they play the kind of roles we've set out for them. And with a little bit of terminology or, yeah, something like terminology here, we can help ourselves. So, let's distinguish between what we'll call a particular and a universal. And this is both terminological and a metaphysical distinction, right? But a particular is something that is an example, but it cannot itself be exemplified. That is, it's an instance, but cannot be instanced. So it's easier to think about this in terms of examples, haha, right? But a particular fire truck, or my sweater, or Tilburg University, or the number 2. The number 2 is a hard one. But if we think of the number itself somehow, that might be one. Right? That is, particular objects, individuals, things. Those are particulars. They're specific, there's one, they're not repeatable. Contrast that with a universal. A universal is another kind of entity. It's a thing, but it's a special kind of thing. It's a thing that can be exemplified or instanced. So redness, or being red, being a university, humanity, wisdom, humility, being 2 in number. If these are things, they're things that, at least in theory, could be exemplified by other things. So blackness is a good one, right? Black, 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 the chairs, my hat, right? Dude's laptop. All of these things look like they are instances or exemplifiers of blackness. Or being a chair. There's a hell of a lot of them in this room, right? Whether you count these as chairs, debatable, right? Same thing with if we think about folding desks, right? So the universal would be an entity, a thing, that has this property of being able to be instanced. So what we'll call realists, or realism about properties, think properties are universals. The contrast class, nominalists, don't. If they think properties exist, they do not think of them as universals. They will be other kinds of particulars, special kinds of particulars. And the different options, the different variants within these 2 big camps hinge on, if they're realists, what kind of universals they think they are. And for the nominalists, what kind of particulars properties turn out to be, if they turn out to be anything at all. So that's going to be the big debate. That's what we're going to talk about for the rest of today, right? Realists say universals exist, properties are universals, and then they're going to differ about what exactly universals are, what they're like, how they work. Nominalists, or non-realists, irrealists about properties, are going to say universals don't exist, there are no such things, and if there are any properties, they're going to be other kinds of particulars.
For nominalists, color would not be a property, because we can give different examples.
It could be a property, but it's not going to be a universal. It's going to just be some other kind of particular. So it might be a thing, but it's not one of these special kinds of things. So here's the big difference. Here's the big difference, right? Both the nominalist and the realist agree that universals, were they to exist, would be things. They would be objects, in some sense of objects, right? Entities. Let's use entity as a non-loaded term. But importantly, they would be entities that could be exemplified. Where exemplification is a kind of nebulous little relation where it's something like instanced.
I don't know if this is related, but like, can you see the universals as something that's always the case in all possible worlds?
Sometimes, man.
The nominalist would say, so your sweater is red, but in another world would be black, and that's why it's not a universal, or not.
That's loading particular views into the realist and nominalist bounds. That's not a terrible way to think about it, at least initially, right?
Okay.
But yeah, the big thing is whether these universals, these kinds of entities exist. The realist says yes, the nominalist says no. It'll be helpful as maybe to just kind of keep that in the background. We'll once we see some of the options, some of the views, the difference here will maybe become a little bit clearer. So let's talk about realists. Let's talk about realism first, because there's basically just two flavors. Forms of realism disagree about what universals are. They agree that universals are, they agree universals exist. They disagree about, if you like, where they are. Plato is the arch transcendent realist. He believes in what we might call Platonic universals. Universals exist, but they're abstract objects. Contrast this with Aristotle. Aristotle, at least in the kind of contemporary tradition, is taken to believe in what we'll call immanent universals. He thinks universals exist, but they're concrete. So both of them think universals exist. They differ about what kind of entity they are. Plato says they're abstract. Aristotle says they're concrete. And that's why you have the disagreement. That's why Plato's pointing up to the realm of the forms, the abstracta, and your man Aristotle has got his head firmly looking down into the world of the senses, the concrete objects. Honest to God, I think this is one of my favorite philosophy memes. With that, forms are intangible and don't exist in this realm, much like your game, son. But importantly, they are both realists. They're both realists about universals. They think they exist. They just differ in what kind of entity they are. Platonic says they're abstract. Aristotelian says they're concrete. Now let's try and cash the views out a little more, right? So the Platonic universal view, whether it was actually held by Plato is debatable. An early version of Bertrand Russell certainly held this view. Many contemporary metaphysicians hold this view. Again, the thought here is that universals exist and are abstract. They exist in the unfortunately named third realm. Note, they are not objects. That is, they're not tables, people, universities, things like this. They're a sui generis kind of entity. So the Platonic realist, the transcendental realist, believes in at least two different types of entities: objects and universals. Different types, different ontological categories, if you like. Platonic universals don't exist in space and time. They exist in some abstract realm. They don't change. They're immutable. And importantly, they also don't go into or out of existence. So what this means is that in theory, there could be a whole slew of Platonic universals that do not have and will never have any instances. But they're still there.
With not objects, do you mean concrete objects? Or
So they are not, strictly speaking, objects of any kind. They're a different category of entity whatsoever. So they're still concrete or abstract. In this case, they're abstract, but they're not objects. They're different types of things. Here's a way to kind of do a comparison. Right? We might believe in all sorts of objects, And we might want to distinguish objects from events. Events are things that objects could be part of or participate in. But events aren't objects. They're a different kind of entity whatsoever.
But this is, so when you say object now, it's something different than concrete or abstract object. It's a different sense of object.
So concrete and abstract are effectively just kind of, if you like, properties we can apply to entities.
Yeah.
So what our Platonic universalist wants to say is universals exist. They're a distinct kind of entity from objects, and they are abstract.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So that's the Platonic view, roughly. And we can say something like this. Hey, when is a predication true, right? When is X is F true? Where X is a name and F is a predicate. Well, X is F if and only if something like X participates in the universal Fness, or X instantiates the universal Fness, or has Fness. Or another one, and this is arguably something like what Plato had, again, I'm not going to debate this too much, is that X resembles the form of Fness. Exactly how to cash out resemblance or instantiation or participation is one of the difficulties for this view. And note, if we postulate these universals, these Platonic universals, we've got a good story to tell in response to our arguments. Right? Our one over many argument said, hey, what was it that explains why the red fire truck and the red apple are similar? Answer, they both participate in or instantiate the universal of redness. What is it that our predicates refer to? Universals. What does redness mean? Right? It denotes universal. And of course, our quantification story can now be satisfied because the thing we're quantifying over were these universals, these abstract entities. So, a good story at least on that front. But of course, right, you know how this works. Now that we've set it up, let's knock it down. This view has quite a few interesting problems with it. One that sometimes gets discussed is how many universals are there? That is, does every predicate correspond to a universal? And there's a pretty good argument for thinking that they better not. Because one property that you might want to have is the property that only exists if it doesn't exist. Basically, we run a version of the kind of Russell paradox argument with a particularly loaded and bad predicate. So again, think about the predicate.
The barber?
Yeah, right?
Oh,
the Barber case, right?
Oh, yeah.
So let's turn the Barber case into a predicate. If every predicate corresponds to a property, we have just introduced a very explosive entity into the abstract realm. Because now we have to be committed to the existence of a contradictory object. Sorry, I shouldn't say object. Contradictory entity. That's bad. So the move then is to say, okay, only some predicates correspond to properties. And now we need to say which ones count and which ones don't.
So, let's say you're talking about a construct or an ID, like kindness, like a virtue kindness. You can say someone is really helpful, someone is really nice, all these different words to different entities maybe to describe one ID.
We don't want to call them ideas, right? They're not ideas.
But there's not the same about as to Platonic.
So importantly, ideas. These are not ideas. These are abstract entities. They do not exist in the mind. They are not ideas.
But like, didn't Plato also think that ideas are outside of us?
Yep. He thought ideas were abstract objects.
Is it then the same?
Not necessarily, right? We might think mental things are physical. So we don't want to equate the realm of the mental with the realm of the abstract. So here's a really easy reason why. If you're a physicalist about the mind, you don't think that mental stuff is abstract. You think it's concrete.
Material.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we don't want to automatically equate mental with abstract or mental with physical. Keep it flexible here.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why it's good to keep it separate.
Yeah.
That's why the abstract concrete distinction is one thing.
It's necessary.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. So, again, we have this issue about which universals there are. That's tough, hard to answer. Two bigger worries, and these are the genuinely big worries, is we have a kind of instantiation regress. I know I'll put this in terms of instantiation, but we could talk about it in terms of resemblance, or we can talk about it in terms of participation. But the basic thought is, okay, look, if you're a realist, if you're a Platonic realist, all properties are universals. What one kind of property are relations. Right? So like loves, or believes, right? Or, oh shit, instantiates, or participates, or resembles. So what relation is that? What's the relation of instantiation? It looks like it needs to be a Platonic universal too. But if it's a Platonic universal, then we have a problem. And the problem is effectively, you can either have a circular explanation or an infinite regress. The circular explanation is, to go back, we say x is f if and only if x instantiates fness. So we have to understand instantiation to understand instantiation. We've used instantiation to define itself. That's bad. That's the regress option. Sorry, that's the circular option. The regress option is we just say, no, right? You just have to stand in the relation. And every time you stand in the relation, what you'll have to say is, my sweater instantiates the relation of instantiation to redness. But of course, if it does that, then it also has to instantiating to redness. We have to have the glue every time.
So the infinite regress is the same as like the unmoved mover, where you have to go to causation and the causation of causation to the causation of...
In some sense, except with the unmoved mover, we're always going one level back. What we have here is something like this, right? So let's have A, and we have the predicate, I don't know, loves, and we have B. Right? We might write our relation this way. So A loves B. Importantly, for this to work, what we have to have is there has to be a little instantiation relation holding between A and the loves predicate. But of course, for this to link these two, we have to have instantiation between the two of them, like that. And of course, for that to hold, we have to have instantiation holding between these. And so on and so on and so on and so on and so on.
So it's not really going backwards, it's just multiplying.
In order for instantiation to ever do its job, it would have to do it an infinite number of times. Basically, right, we need glue to stick the two together and to say, hey, here's the glue. It's not sticky. So this regress problem, that's an issue. Instantiation either needs to turn out to not be a universal, in which case, cool, but then why did I need to believe in universals to begin with? Because I can get away without them. Or, we've got a problem. Lots and lots of I's in there. Another version of this is, again, I imagine David might have talked to you about this, Plato's third man argument. Have you guys talked about this already? So, effectively, really quickly, we can run through this. Suppose the universal redness is red. That is, suppose universals can self-instantiate. They can be an instance of themselves. Well, universals are supposed to explain the unity, the resemblance between all of the things that instance the universal, right? Redness is supposed to be the thing that explains why all the red objects are similar. But if redness is one of the red things, then it needs to somehow explain why all of those red things are similar and itself. So it looks like what we really need is now what we might call like redness plus, which is the thing that explains why all the red objects and this red universal are similar. But then we ask about redness plus. Is redness plus itself red plus or not? And if it is, new problem. Now we have to have redness plus plus. And we ask about redness plus plus. You see how this goes. So the thought is, every time we try and explain unity, we have to postulate yet another entity, a third man to do the job. And then we have to have a fourth to explain the three, and a fifth, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Yeah?
But wouldn't that only apply to like Plato's version of this? Because in the Aristotle, the one from Aristotle, he says that universes are concrete. So
We're getting there. Yeah. So these are just objections to this kind of Platonic version, right? Platonic realism. No, what the immediate and easy response to this is just say universals never instantiate, never self-instantiate. But that's a problem because being a universal looks like it should be a universal. So, not a happy story either way. Now, this could be a very good reason to turn to our other realist option, right? So, Plato says universals exist, they're abstract. Aristotle says, nah, fam, concrete. Right? Universals exist and they are concrete objects. So this is, again, arguably an Aristotelian view. Whether it exactly is, unclear. It's certainly a view that David Armstrong defended and spelled out quite neatly. So the idea is, again, universals are not objects. They're not objects. They're entities, but not objects. They're sui generis entities. But they are going to be spatiotemporally located. They're concrete. They're in space and time. They can enter into causal relationships. They can change. What we're going to say is that universals will be constituent components of particulars. So redness will be a part of the fire engine of the red apple of my sweater. Pinkness is a part of, in some sense, my phone cover. So it's somehow like a component of these objects. So we drag universals out of the realm of abstracta and throw them into the dirty, filthy concrete world. So where are they located? Well, they're located wherever their instances are. So redness is going to be located where every red instance is. So it's here in your dude's Levi logo. Right? I think there's a red sticker on your laptop. Right? Every location of a thing that's red is also a location of redness. Redness will be, if you like, a spatiotemporally distributed entity, located where each one of its instances is. So you get something like this, right? An object satisfies a predicate if and only if the universal of fness is one of these constituent parts. It's a part, in some sense, of the object. But note, we have to be careful here, because there's multiple senses of part that can be involved. There's a difference between what we might think of as everyday part and the sense of part in play here. An easy example of this, if we think about our table, and we think about the parts that are the legs. The legs are parts of the table. That is, these objects stand in a part in relation to this whole thing. But that part-whole relationship is distinct from how being a table is a part of this object. It's not like I could somehow snap off that part. It's not a physical part. It's not an objectual part. It's some kind of constituent component in a different sense. So, again, Aristotelian view, universals exist, they're concrete, they are parts of, in some special sense of parthood, the things they're instances of. And notably on this view, universals can go into and out of existence. If all of the instances go away, so does the universal. If in a wild fit of rage someone destroyed all of the red things and made sure there was never ever again any red objects, redness would cease to be. Again, it's a slightly silly example. Tables maybe work better. Depending on how climate change go, being human might be a property that ceases to exist. Hey, happy days. So this is the kind of Aristotelian view. Right? Universals exist, but they're concrete. Now, this is a really lovely view. And in fact, I think of any of the kind of options, this is the one that most people tend to adopt. But it does have some issues. So one issue actually has to do with the same question we asked for the Platonic realist. Right? How many universals are there? Does every predicate correspond to a universal? The Aristotelian realist has an obvious answer. No, because there'll be plenty of predicates that just aren't instanced, so obviously no universals for them. But Armstrong and a lot of Aristotelians go further, and they say, hey, look, actually there's nothing like disjunctive universals or negative universals, so there's no property of not being a bus. There's the property of being a bus, and then there's a bunch of stuff that just doesn't have that property. There isn't a special non-bussy property. Exactly. That's what I was thinking too. Armstrong also adds a requirement that says only properties that have any causal efficacy, that make causal difference, exist. Now, notably, this is something detachable from Aristotelian view per se, but it gives you a way to restrict down. The two big issues with this Aristotelian approach have to do with making sense of the core notions. Right? So one of the core problems here is making sense of location. The Aristotelian says universals are located where their instances are. So they have to be able to explain how it is that we can have multiple things in exactly the same place in exactly the same time. And that's weird. It's not a huge problem, but it's an oddity. And a related issue here, a related locational issue, is where are relations located? If we think about loves, which is meant to be a universal, right? Where is the loving located between Romeo and Juliet, say? Is it where Romeo is? Is it where Juliet is? Is it somewhere exactly in between them? Is it where both of them are? None of the answers seem very good for various reasons. We can talk a little bit about that maybe in the tutorial. And the other big objection, again, hinges on making sense of the big idea. What's the special notion of parthood? I can make sense of this, the leg being part of the table. What is it to say that tableness is part of this thing? What's the special notion of parthood? This constituent component thing. I don't understand. These aren't necessarily knockdown objections, but they raise problems for the view. Okay. So, before we go on, do we have a feeling on the two realist views? Do they make sense? Have a grip on them? Again, both of them, they're flavors that are kind of similar, right? It's like, do you like white chocolate or dark chocolate better? Abstract objects or concrete objects? Go nuts. Which one do you prefer? Some slightly silly ones as an objection to the Aristotelian, and I want to mention them before we go on. because I love the first one. So, in order for the story to make sense, the Aristotelian needs to be able to disambiguate universals from particulars. Because universals need to be the sui generis type of entity. But if you think time travel is possible, then it looks like the distinction might break down. Because you could have the same individual, the same particular, being multiply located. And that tends to be the way they demarcate universals from individuals. So if time travel is possible, then it looks like we might have a problem with the distinction between individuals and universals. Another kind of funny objection, and this is something particularly threatening for Armstrong, is what comes first? Do we get objects and then start to stick properties on them? Do we get properties and then build objects out of them? There doesn't seem to be a good reason to prefer one over the other. And in fact, Armstrong says both of them are equally fundamental. The base unit for the Aristotelian isn't an object and isn't properties, it's an object having properties. So it's what Armstrong calls a state of affairs.
Is it just saying like it's not one that's going before the other, but they're just exactly at the same moment?
Yeah, you always have to have both. You can
Okay.
never kind of separate an object from its properties or properties from the object.
Okay.
The fundamental unit is going to be an object having some properties, the state of affairs.
Like, was that the excellent part of?
It's not too far off, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Another way to put it is Armstrong thinks that this subject-predicate bit of language actually really does capture something like the fundamental ontological entity. The base unit, if we think about what's out there in the world, is subjects with predicates. That's the kind of fundamental building block of reality. The view. Okay. So those are our two flavors of realism, right? Again, the Platonic view, universals are up there as abstract objects and they're instanced, and that runs into various difficulties. The Aristotelian drags universals out back into concrete reality and then tries to locate them in the places where their instances are. Both of them, though, accept the existence of universals. What about if we go the other way? So we'll talk through these relatively quickly, and I'll put up a video talking through these options in more detail because I'd like to make sure that we have all of this stuff covered. Right? So our nominalist, right, let me rewind. When you're faced with the problems with realism, you might think, you know what, I would really like to try and get by without buying into universals. And this is where we'd adopt a form of nominalism. So nominalism is, ironically, named after the term of or having to do with names. Nominal. So the nominalist wants to try and get by with only names. That is, with only objects. So the nominalist isn't going to postulate two categories of entities. They're not going to say there's objects and properties. They're going to say there are only objects. And if properties exist, they're special kinds of objects. So there's basically two kinds of nominalists. There's what we'll call reductive ones and eliminative ones. Reductive ones think properties exist, but they're special particulars. They're special objects. So they're not a new kind of being. Contrast that with eliminative nominalists who say, yeah, fuck properties. I don't believe in them at all. And their big job is going to be trying to satisfy whatever the property role is using something that is not properties at all. The difference between these two is subtle, but does the difference here make sense? So we can maybe think about the difference between the realist and nominalist. The realist says, okay, I think there's at least two categories of entities. I think there's particulars, and I think there are universals. And there's at least one of each type. But these are two different types of thing. So our realist says there's both. Our nominalist says, I only believe in one kind of being. I only believe in particulars. Now, as it happens, I might believe in two kinds of particulars. I might have objects and universals, where universals are some weird kind of object, weird kind of particular. But I don't think they're a distinct sui generis category. So an example will help us out here. A nominalist who's a reductive nominalist, who thinks properties exist but they're types of particulars, will be someone like a trope theorist. So a trope theorist says, hey, okay, look, I don't think there are any universals, but I still think there's something like the redness of this sweater. The redness of this sweater is a concrete entity. It's located here-ish. And the redness of this sweater is very similar to the redness of your man's Levi's logo. Sort of. They're both kind of faded, so. But the redness of the Levi's logo and the redness of the sweater are different things. They're different objects, but they're both objects. So what can we say about property talk? Property talk is just a way for us to generalize from these particulars. So every time we thought we were talking about a universal, what we're really doing is talking about a particular instance property. The redness of this sweater, the redness of that logo, the yellowness of that sweater, the greenness of the board, right? Each one of these is a trope, a particular instanced property. And then what's going to kind of generalize is the resemblance between these. Yeah.
But isn't pointing out the resemblance also universal?
You've already seen the big problem for this view. Right. So the big aim for this kind of reductive nominalist is, hey, I can get by with just individuals. The problem is, cool, why are these the same? Or how, in virtue of what are these the same? That's the big problem for a trope theorist. In fact, basically, something like that is going to be the problem for all of the nominalists. Because remember, the big advantage for the realist is they have a thing that is literally shared. And that is how they can explain resemblance. Everybody else, it's really hard to figure out what's shared. So one more really quick, to kind of get a grip on this reductive nominalist. And again, I'll post a video talking through these with some more depth. Another reductive nominalist is a class nominalist. And technically, we could replace class with set theory nominalist. So a class nominalist says properties exist. What are they? They're sets. Sets are individuals. They're particulars. They're special kinds of particulars. We define them using our set theory. But they're still particulars. And that's what universals really would be. If there were any such things, they're just sets. So I can get by with only particulars. And what is it to be red? It's to be a member of the set of red things. Why are these red things similar? Because they're both members of this set. So in this case, what we do is we reduce properties to a relatively familiar kind of entity, a particular we can make sense of. Now the contrast class, it's a reductive nominalist, is a limitive nominalist. And the limitive nominalists say, you know what, I don't even want these things at all. I want no talk with properties at all. So they are going to try and get away without ever postulating any kind of property. So their big challenge is going to be to make sense of things like the quantificational argument or explain away any feeling we have of a need for explanation in the one over many. So we'll talk more about these as we go. Okay. So what we're going to do, we'll pick up next Tuesday, and we're going to pivot away from thinking about properties to thinking about individuals, objects, particulars. And we're going to really focus on how it is singular terms refer to particular objects. So there's a really fun little reading from Russell. It's not terribly long. Give it a go. And we'll talk again about how singular terms work. Thanks for coming, guys. See you all Tuesday morning.